Welcome back to another episode of ScotLand Matters, the official podcast of Scottish Land Estates, where we talk about all things rural affairs and land-based business in Scotland. I'm Cameron Gillies, Press and Public Affairs Manager here at SLE, and I'm excited to be hosting today's episode, the first in our new series. We're recording today's episode in the midst of an incredibly busy time in rural affairs for Scotland. Bills and legislation are coming thick and fast through Holyrood on a range of topics from agriculture and visitor levies to housing, wood-burning stoves, and of course, land reform. And then there's the small matter of the general election, with key seats in rural Scotland forming the battlegrounds between the major forces in Scottish politics. It's a busy time, and with me today to discuss all of this and more is SLE's Chief Executive, Sarah Jane Laing, and Director of Policy, Stephen Young. Welcome back to the podcast, both of you.
Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you.
So we're just off the back of our annual conference held at the Assembly Rooms recently, where we were joined by politicians from across the political spectrum. So my first question today is on those politicians and politicians across Holyrood and Westminster. Is to ask whether you've seen a change recently in tone from politicians you've been speaking to about rural issues recently. Do you feel that there's a deeper understanding of rural issues, or do you still feel like there's a gap in knowledge there that needs to be filled despite all of the changes that we've seen recently?
It's a great question. I'm going to jump in first, Stephen, as I usually do. I think there has been a change, and it's not just about rural, it's actually about business. And one of the things that we were lucky enough to have the Scottish Labour leader, Anna Sarwar, talking at our conference. One of the first things he said was, I'm talking to you as I do to every other business audience. And so for Scottish Labour to recognise that SLE isn't just land ownership, it's a land-based business, that was a big shift. And certainly I think the rhetoric from Labour, north and south of the border, about that kind of rural reset is definitely starting to kind of trickle through. We've had great correspondence and communication with some of the MP candidates standing for Labour, as well as discussions with people like Daniel Zeichner, who has been in the shadow cabinet. Others, Stephen, closer to home, there's definitely been a shift with the recent changes in cabinet.
Yeah, obviously we've got a change in the top team of First Minister and Deputy First Minister, both being rural MSPs now, so they can't help but bring that kind of rural knowledge, and there is obviously business skills and knowledge there as well. And I think going back to the conference, with Jim Fairley speaking there as a minister, Jim has run his own business, he's run his own farm, he understands the challenges of running a business. I think that was quite clear amongst that. Anna Sarwar was similarly talking about the challenges of running business. I think it's having that understanding of what the impact of legislation actually is, not what can be done or could be done, but actually what it means in practice. And I think we're possibly going to see a little bit more of that. And I think we've seen First Minister talking about less strategies, more doing, because I think that's something that's really important as well. So I think in general that the tone has changed fairly significantly. The rhetoric's probably changed. We just need to see that backed up with deeds and actions now.
And I think we have to mention the end of the Butte House Agreement, because I think the bulk of people involved in rural land-based businesses were happy to see an end to that. I do hope that we see an end to some of the policies. I know we're going to come back and talk about some of the legislation in more detail, but it'd be good to see a real different approach from Mr. Swinney and from Kate Forbes in relation to kind of what's already in motion as a result of that Butte House Agreement. We need them to revisit some of the stuff that's already there, as well as kind of looking forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into that a bit. We do now have a First Minister and a Deputy First Minister in Scotland who represent the rural constituencies. And we've started to see some signs from the government that they're willing to listen to rural communities, more so perhaps than most recent administrations, particularly after the end of the Butte House Agreement. We've seen Gillian Martin U-turning on a ban on installing wood-burning stoves in new homes under a bit of pressure from opposition. Do you see any other areas of legislation coming up just now that's going to affect the rural sector, where we might see some movement in line with these views being expressed coming from the rural sector?
I think there's potential for that. Whether we see U-turns as such on things, I'm not sure, but certainly movement and thinking. We've seen a little bit of that with short-term lets, of reviewing the terms of some of those licences and whether we can soften around the edges to allow the tourism industry to function properly, allow us to deal with flexible requirements for short-term lets. The one where we really could do with seeing a bit more of a change is on housing. We've got the housing bill that's there just now. I think the impacts of that are potentially huge on housing. We've now got a housing emergency declared. I think that bill in itself is a huge opportunity to really set out and say we've got a housing emergency and this is what we're going to do about it, because there's a real danger right now that the bill as it stands could make that emergency even worse, and that's the last thing we want to do.
I think what we've seen, Cameron, is the Scottish Government responding to some really strong opposition. So we've had, the Conservatives in terms of the wood-burning stoves, Labour also being really active in other areas. So the Scottish Government has responded. I think what we need them to do is start being proactive. So as I say, Stephen mentioned housing. It'd be great to see the Housing Minister look at the, housing in its totality, not just what's affecting supply. One of the things that's affecting supply is a lack of confidence from investors, lack of confidence from private landlords. So the way to do that is revisit some of the policies that Patrick Harvey brought forward. So proactive rather than just responding to some excellent opposition from other parties at Holyrood.
I think there is a midpoint there as well, because there's a way of protecting the rights of tenants and ensuring everyone has affordable, warm, secure homes, but also not stifling supply. I think there is a middle ground which can deal with both those issues at the same time. It's not a binary choice.
No, it's about balance. And I think one thing that we were always trying to encourage the Scottish Government under the Beat House Agreement was to look at where that kind of sweet spot, that balance was. It did feel, though, that the default was intervention and control, which from a market point of view is never really going to work. It is about that balance, the sweet spot. Stephen, you talked about that a little bit at the conference, about finding that sweet spot, and it doesn't feel as though that's been achieved in many policy areas recently.
No, it is. What I was talking about was a balance between kind of efficient markets and resilience as well, and there's always that point where things work, but there's also the two extremes where things just don't work, and it shouldn't be too difficult to find that balancing point.
Yeah, and clearly listening to rural communities doesn't start with rowing back on poor decisions made in the first place. It starts with getting those decisions right to begin with. Now, there's a lot going on just now in Scottish Parliament legislation. One of the key bills we've been working on has been the Agriculture Bill, where we've been quite successful in securing some key amendments to improve the bill. So I wondered what you thought has been key to our ability to make the case for some of the changes we've been able to secure, and some of the changes that other sort of stakeholder organisations looking at all of this legislation have been able to secure recently.
I think there's a number of ways. I mean, to an extent, the beauty of the opportunity now is that we have got a relatively blank piece of paper as to what comes next after EU regulation and EU payment schemes. So we have had that ability to do that. I think the industry itself has spoken very clearly and not quite as one voice, but we've put forward really strong arguments for certain elements to be in there, and we've worked together with the Food and Agriculture Stakeholder Task Force, which is pulling together a lot of rural bodies, and I think that kind of working together and agreeing, and sometimes agreeing not to agree on certain things, but agreeing on certain points that we're all think are essential for what we need to do to go forward, and then taking them forward to government, and government have been beginning to listen on that, which is always good. So we've heard for a long time about co-design of agricultural policy, and I think that's maybe not played out in reality as it has in theory. We're possibly seeing a little bit more of that now, and we have seen government more willing to accept kind of opposition amendments and things to improve things, better linkage between the Good Food Nation Act and the Agriculture and Communities Bill, and just that understanding of how things fit together. So there's some really good things in there, including things like venison being included in there potentially for support as well. Some of the elements around continuous professional development, something that I think it could be useful for the industry if it's done properly, and we can deal with all sorts of things around skills, recruitment, retention, but also the health and safety record of agriculture. We can possibly improve all of those things. So it's there are some real positives in there. The concern is just the pace of change as well. We need really clear signals. We don't expect everything right down to the finite detail, but just those real signals to allow people to invest and think long term would be really useful.
Yeah. I think for me there was probably two things, and you touched on it. One was the cooperation within the sector. So the sector, working really well to come together on sort of shared positions. But the other one was actually how the committee and how MSPs have worked. It has felt very constructive. I think it's been very much focused on delivering for the sector. It hasn't felt as though there's been an awful lot of politics with a small p at kind of this stage. And the Cabinet Secretary's been willing to listen. I think there has been that kind of willingness from the Cabinet Secretary and their senior officials to sort of say, well, okay, how can we improve this? It hasn't felt as adversarial as perhaps some other legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. SJ, there's no escaping the land reform bill for us at the moment. We've just lodged our response to the consultation on the bill, and we've spent a morning briefing journalists on our views on that. There's been a lot of coverage of that, which we've been quite happy with, particularly on your view of the bill that, as drafted, it would be gambling with the future of rural communities. I wondered if you could talk a little bit to us about what you meant by that.
Yeah, I was reflecting on this after our press conference, and I joined this organisation just not long after the 2003 Act. So it kind of feels as though land reform has kind of been part of my my life at SLE for, well, it will be sort of 2 decades now. And I think what the point I was trying to make in terms of my comments about gambling is that I really do think that when you look at what's been delivered in rural Scotland, whether that's for people or for jobs, for nature, the rural businesses are underpinning the delivery of positive outcomes in rural Scotland. I think that's I think it's an undisputed fact. When you look at whether that's the wellbeing economy indicators, the scale research that we've done, but the research by others, other business organisations, the evidence is clear that I suppose landowners, land managers, estates of all shapes and sizes are underpinning all those positive outcomes. And when I say all shapes and sizes, I mean all types of governance. It's not just about private owners here. The measures which have been brought forward by the Scottish Government, in my view, disregard all of that, and they go back to ideology. And I think if you're basing laws on ideology, then what you will end up with is achieving the outcomes that are usually directly opposite to what you set out to do. Because you're not looking at the evidence base, you're not looking at what's being delivered now, and you're not looking at how can you improve that. How do you inspire people to do more of the good stuff? You actually then you go back to focusing very much on that kind of lowest common denominator, this idea that there's something wrong. And it was really disappointing to hear the Cabinet Secretary, trot out that writing historical line, wrongs line again recently. That's not how we should be developing legislation in Scotland. It should be what are the positive outcomes that we want to achieve? What is the negative behaviour that we want to prevent? And how do we together come up with legislation that maximises the positive and deals with the negative in the small instances that they actually occur? We can talk about some more of the provisions within the bill, but I think it's been striking to me that when I've been reading lots of commentary on this, that regardless of kind of where you come from in terms of your sort of land reform ideology, people are sort of saying this just doesn't work. When you've got me and Andy Whiteman saying this is an unworkable bill, surely the Scottish Government maybe needs to kind of sort of take a step back and think, okay, what are people saying? This level of bureaucracy, when we're still not clear how some of the current legislation that was put in place in 2015, 2016 works in practice, just doesn't seem like the right move to me at all.
Yeah. And Stephen, you were at the press briefing there as well. What were your thoughts on the sort of key issues that we managed to cover with them, and where do you think the interest from a, I suppose, press point of view and a public point of view are in the bill?
I think we're trying to cover a myriad of points, and that's one of the things with the bill is the complexity of it and all the different points that it covers. I think quite a lot from journalists was around property rights and where that sits, that how the justification for interference in property markets was one of the things they were questioning us quite deeply on. But I think going back to SJ's point again, I think it's this feeling sometimes that everything's broken. We've got this new idea, so that takes precedence, and the solution to all problems is more legislation. I think we've talked quite a lot, and I talked at the conference about complexity, and this layering of complexities makes life so much harder. And she was talking about the different land reform bills. I think I was at primary school in 2003, so it's that layering up of different land reform bills, how they interact with other bills and acts as well, and that sometimes actually causes more confusion and stifles things more than it would improve. One of the key points we're keen to get across is this this assumption that scale is a bad thing, and that's not necessarily the case. We've shown with a lot of research about the benefits of scale, and this use of scale as a proxy for the deemed concentrated pattern of land ownership, that some are using scale will solve that. And actually, if there are, as Esty says, if there are behaviours around concentration of power that need dealt with, then well, let's deal with them. Let's deal with that. Don't try and go off in a different direction and sort of deal with it, but sort of clout everyone else as well and stifle things. We heard Colin Galbraith from Nature Scot at our conference talking about the scale's necessary for what they want to do for nature, for wildlife, for biodiversity. So what we've got to really focus on is not just about what we can change, but what have we already got? How do we make sure we make the best of that and build on that? And I think that improvement would be better than sweeping everything to the side, saying we're going to start again and we're going to do it differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at some of the central premises to what I think are positive land reform discussions about visibility, transparency of ownership, allowing people to have a voice in influencing land use and land management decisions, we've already got lots of things in Scotland that should allow you to do that. Everything from our voluntary registration of land to register of controlling interest, in terms of that. But we've also got the planning system. So the planning system, in terms of NPF4, what is our national conversation we're having about land use? It actually set out a really, really clear framework. But the reality is that most of Scotland didn't get involved in that conversation and now are starting to kind of realise what that means in practice for land use change in Scotland. Quite substantive in some areas. And then when you go down to local level, we've got a fantastic concept in terms of placemaking, local place plans that should allow for shared visions for the future of local areas to be created. Everyone having a voice, both those people who have a business stake, people who live there, and indeed people who kind of visit there. A young, the young voice as well. That should be happening across Scotland. Where it does happen, we had our vice chair policy. Patrick Calhoun from LUS at the press conference, and he talked about the fact that they funded that in LUS. It's a framework supported by the National Park. Where you have that, you see a clear benefit. The Scottish Government should be ploughing some of the money that they're going to spend on new staff to deal with this bureaucratic nightmare that will be the land reform legislation to deliver proper place plans across Scotland. I'm a real advocate of a properly functioning planning system. And Stephen, I think I'm right in saying that both the political speakers, Jim Fairley and Anna Sauer, referred to the Scottish planning system as being broken at our conference, which was quite interesting. We didn't delve into that at the conference, but quite an admission.
It is. They both talked about it in different ways, and Anna Sauer talked about the length of time to get planning through in Glasgow compared to Manchester. It was significantly longer now. Do we smooth that out? I think the Land Commission have talked about it as well in terms of some of their research into what the blockages are for rural housing, and they found the main one was planning, and it can be a nightmare when we speak to members and own experiences of dealing with planners. It's not fun in any way, and fully understand planners have a role to ensure that everything's in keeping with the area and all the rest of it. But it does feel they are more kind of policing it rather than being enablers to more housing. But I think that's a really good point. Is it's what's here already that we're not using properly we need to look at. So we've got regional land use partnerships. They're still in their second pilot now, which is fine, but we need to say, well, will they work or will they not? Local place plans, we've already said, aren't really working properly. In terms of community ownership, we've got the Land Accelerator scheme with the Crown Estate. That's only just started. They're at the design stage, and that was designed to allow more communities to buy land with the Crown Estate effectively buying it first and then passing it on. So there's this kind of, we've got things there. There's this assumption that none of these are working, and therefore we need more. But actually, we could look at them and say, well, what bits need fixed there? Yeah. And if that doesn't work, let's look at more again.
Well, just on that, there will be a formal review of the community right to buy legislation that's read in the statute book. That's not going to report until after this current bill is through the Parliament. That just doesn't make sense to me. So like Stephen, I suppose the core message from us at the moment is, can we please just stop and look at what we've got? If there's things that aren't working properly when it comes to delivering, that land reform vision, which for us is about getting the best out of our land for people, jobs and nature, what is it that we need to change? I don't think what's needed is the legislation that's currently currently in the land reform bill. And kind of, one of the things that we talked about again at the conference in terms of that kind of gambling, there's investment that's ready to come into rural Scotland that could be game changing for some of our rural communities. It would create jobs. It would create really valued jobs in some remote rural areas. That investment is sitting on hold at the moment, particularly because of the provisions in terms of lotting, that forced fragmentation of land. If you're looking to invest, particularly in some areas such as commercial forestry, but also in terms of landscape scale environmental schemes, that's a real disincentive in terms of inward investment into Scotland. And I don't think that that's properly reflected in all the impact assessments that the civil servants have pulled together.
Yeah, there's some really strong messages there, and ones that I know that everyone in the SLA team is working really hard to communicate to the Scottish Government and everybody in politics. We've spoken quite a lot about what's going on in Holyrood, and rightly so, that there is loads happening, but it's really hard to ignore the sort of big ticket political items.
Is there something else happening?
Just a wee thing happening down south. Due on the 4th of July, we're not expecting too many fireworks for that, I hope. To torture that awful American cliche, but we're looking quite closely at the general election, and we see it as an opportunity for us to look at how the UK government can support rural Scotland. So a final question for both of you before we wrap up is, what would you like to see parties bring forward in terms of ideas that they could implement for the next UK government to really help rural Scotland thrive?
I think you touched on rural proofing earlier on, and I think that's something that we really would like Westminster and, of course, Holyrood to look at. And by rural proofing, what we don't mean is developing your policies and at the end of it sort of saying, oh, will this work in rural Britain? Will this work in rural Scotland? It's having the rural voice, the rural experts involved at the outset, and it's doing a sort of rural impact assessment at every stage of policy development and every stage of development of legislation. That's what we want a commitment for. I think as well, Stephen, you want to talk on this in more detail. We do need to see continued investment, that commitment to investment in rural Britain and rural Scotland from the Westminster government.
Yeah, I think we're just over a week into kind of proper campaigning. I think, like any election, there's been a lot of heat and not very much light, and everyone seems keen to talk about anything but actual policies. So it would be quite good to see that we get down to things. I think, as SJ said, I think that certainty going forward, that multi-annual funding for things like agriculture, to make sure that we know where we can plan and go forward, would be really useful. And I think for rural Scotland, which would really be a game changer, is a proper energy strategy and transmission strategy. How do we get the right energy to the people in rural areas? I think that would be a real game changer for Scotland. That'd be something I'd be looking for from politicians, to have some sort of commitment to that, because at the moment it feels very piecemeal and ad hoc, and there's some good stuff happening, there's some not so good stuff happening. How do we kind of make that more uniform across the board?
Yeah, connection to the grid remains a big issue for our members. We already got a substantive amount of Scotland's renewable energy being produced on SLE members' land, but there's an appetite for that to be even more. And that goes kind of back to that kind of positive contribution that I was referring to earlier. But one of the barriers to that, of course, is the issue that we have in Scotland in terms of connection to the grid.
Absolutely, yeah, important stuff there. Exciting times in politics in Scotland and across the UK. Thank you both so much for taking the time to join us. I know how busy you are. Really appreciate it. And thank you so much as well to our producer, Anine Stevenson, for all of her hard work in the background putting this first episode of our new season together. Looking ahead to our next episode, we're heading to the Highland Show, where we'll be talking all things summer shows, election updates and rural business. We hope you can join us. Goodbye for now.